Welcome to the Writers Co-op, a business podcast for freelance writers everywhere. We are your co-hosts. I am Wudan Yan.
And I'm Jenni.
This week on the podcast, we are going to dig into the art of saying no.
So by now we've talked about finding opportunities to say yes to.
But saying no is also critical in running a freelance business.
Totally. You can't say yes to something if you're filling up your time with assignments that don't pay well or where the clients are mistreating you.
Just a note that we're still living in the Corona times, so we actually went back and forth about how and also when to talk about this topic. We know it's even harder to say no to work right now.
Agreed. It's really a challenge, but I do think with all that's going on, it's really important to stand your ground and make sure that the opportunities that you do have make you feel valued and fit your financial needs as much as possible. Like that extra money is even more valuable right now.
Yeah, time is also a lot more valuable right now. To start, Jenni, do you want to share a few recent examples where you had to say no to a project?
Yes. So I'm actually going to talk about a recent thing which happened a few weeks ago. So right smack in the middle of this time where there is a little bit less work than usual. So I have been talking to an editor for a while. I want to say a couple months. We started talking during the middle of my maternity leave, and I would really love to work with her. So we had been going back and forth talking about ideas. She asked me to send some pitches. I sent her some ideas. And then she let me know about their typical rates. I should have asked about this at the beginning, but she said they have a low rate for trial assignments. So that first assignment that you would do together. But after that, the rate doesn't really jump up that much into a range that would fit with what I usually charge. So she was offering $150 for a story, which would allow me to do about 3 or 4 hours of work. And I had to say no to that. But I also asked her to let me know if the rates would end up looking more flexible in the future.
Oy, that's tricky. I mean, could you have done that work in 3 hours? I'm curious, how did she respond to that?
I definitely couldn't have done the stories I pitched in 3 hours, sadly. And this is something I've actually been talking to folks a lot this week about, the coaching clients we work with. We've been talking about how every story has kind of a maximum version and a minimum version. And could you do the minimum version and fit it into those 3 hours? The answer for me was still no in these cases. And the editor told me that their rates were pretty much set. So, as one of my coaching clients said to me yesterday, there are easier ways to make $100, and writing a 1,000-word story that requires 3 interviews and multiple revisions just wasn't worth $150 for me. It would take up too much time. I know a lot of news outlets have shut down or cut their freelance budgets right now. So keeping that in mind, if the offer had been maybe slightly below my normal rates, I might have taken it so I could get a byline in a new publication and work with this editor. But only spending 3 hours on the stories I pitched would have kind of scared me. It wouldn't have given me time to do due diligence, and I'd be afraid of making mistakes or, not having time to do my best work. So, Wudan, what about you? Tell us a story about how you have said no recently.
So this is also a no story.
Stop.
I had to. It was low-hanging fruit.
It really was.
But the story is, recently an editor at an international publication that I have not worked with reached out to me to do a story about coronavirus. The assignment sounded interesting enough, and my first thought was actually, maybe I'll take it. But the story they proposed to me was also quite ambitious, I thought, and it wasn't until the stage where I almost got the green light that I asked about pay, and it turns out that they could only pay 50 cents a word. I wrote the editor, I was like, my rate is usually $1 a word, and is there any room to negotiate upwards? And ultimately he said no, so I had to pass. I mean, what he was asking was for a story that would pay around $500, require 4-ish interviews. So I'd have to go find those sources, read my notes over. I'd already be at 4 hours or so of work, and it would probably take another 2 hours for me to outline and write, and maybe a little more to edit. The other thing I thought about was I never worked with this editor or client before, and I don't think this pandemic is a good time for me to try out new publications. So I ultimately figured if I wanted to stick to my hourly rate, $50 an hour, it would be a bit of a gamble. So I said no. And I hope that we could work together on something else in the future where the rate would work out for me and the story would work out for them.
So I think that Wudan and I are similar in that we both actually do the math, like she just explained, when we're trying to think about whether we'll take on an assignment. Like we want to see if the assignment is a fit. We're going to think about all of the little bits of how long the reporting is going to take, how long the writing is going to take. So I really love hearing you talk about the numbers.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I almost always math it out in my head like that. And I think with a lot of coaching clients I've had, they ask about how I know how much time is going to go into a story. And I'm very in favor of people tracking how much time it takes for them to write a certain number of words, or I mean, however long an interview is that length of time, right? So there are some knowns in a minimum number of hours that you have to spend. So yeah, I think it's important for people to slowly learn to build a sense of how long it takes to report.
Yeah, I agree. What we're talking about here actually goes back to what we discussed in episode 2, which feels like literally forever ago. But we talked about determining your rates. So if you know what your hourly rate is for a particular service, you can also get a sense for the maximum amount of time you'll spend on the assignment, given the assignment fee. And it makes it a lot easier to know if you're going to say yes or no to something based on the money.
Yes, for sure. Also, the interesting thing for me in that case was that the byline did not mean very much. I think if I were a year or two greener in my career, that might have figured more into my calculus of how much prestige matters.
Yeah, there's definitely a puzzle here when I think about saying no. So for me, it's easiest to say no when something doesn't match my rates. Like that's a really obvious, this doesn't work for me. But I'm also thinking about placement, like what Dan just said. So does placing a story at this publication bolster my credentials enough to get me more better assignments down the line? And then I think about consistency too, like whether or not that assignment could turn into regular work. Occasionally, I'm also considering passion, like, do I care a lot about this issue or this project? I might take a slightly lower rate if something is consistent, or if it'll bolster my reputation in a way that will lead to more work, or if it's super fulfilling. And I also think sometimes there's this like gut feeling about working with someone that will also lead me to say no. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But would Dan, do you have things that you think about when you're thinking about saying no beyond just payment?
Yeah, I mean, what you said, Jenny, goes back to this 2 out of 3 rule, which I think we talked about in a previous episode, where any project needs to fulfill 2 out of 3 buckets of pay, prestige, or passion. But beyond all of this, I really like to do research on new clients. So let's just say I'll definitely say no if an editor who I'd likely be working with has a history of ghosting on writers. I'm not down with that. Coronavirus is not a good time to lose money because somebody didn't edit me soon enough. I think the relationship between a writer as an editor as a relationship and good communication is really key. And I'll also say no if I do my research and that client has trouble paying people on time. And with coronavirus, like I said, I feel like I have even less time to be screwed around by a publication. So I'd rather just do my due diligence beforehand.
Yeah, it's sort of like an hour of research and asking around now can save you many hours later.
Absolutely. Jenny, what do you think is the easiest way to say no?
Good question. So I think the easiest way to say no for me is just not to work with someone in the first place.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
On study hall, like calls for pitches on Twitter and Facebook groups this week, I've been seeing so many low rates, like $200 for a feature or, $400 for a feature in print. And it's really rough.
And it's not so much the editor's fault. I almost rarely blame them, but their budgets are set. And yes, I agree. I think the easiest way to say no is really just to not work with them. Like, don't pitch them. Don't do it. Just don't do it.
Yeah, agreed. If you write them off, then yes, you're definitely limiting your pool of possible clients. But at the same time, the clients who remain will actually be ones who help you pay your bills, which is important.
Very important. I also see a lot of writers making the mistake of trying to negotiate with publishers that don't pay that much. So, in my experience, I've seen it'll probably be pretty rare for a publication to double their rates. Like sometimes they can go up to 1.5x the proposed rate, but if you know that's their limit on a freelance submission, don't pitch them a story that requires super heavy lifting. It goes back to what you were saying about like what's the maximum and what's the minimum version of the story. That's really smart to think about.
Agreed. I think it's super valuable to talk to your colleagues who you've met through building relationships, like Wudan said too, to get some of this information.
Yeah, see our last episode on networking for more on that.
Agreed. But I think, you know, what you want to know is like, who are these clients? What are their priorities? What is it like to work for them? Is it possible to negotiate? What's the edit process like? All of this matters in that decision to say yes or no.
Yeah, and I even get down to more specifics like how much do they pay? How much flexibility do they have in negotiating? What are the pitfalls in their contract? How amenable are they to negotiating contracts? All the things.
Wudan's Encyclopedia to Freelancing. I feel like you should actually publish that. I would read it.
Yeah, it could be good. Maybe somebody will let me make it. But yes, I don't know. I'm just somebody who needs all that information, especially to make an informed decision on whether or not working with someone new is worth it or not.
I think it's really smart.
I think being able to say no is related to how strongly you stick to your boundaries. Whether that's how much you're willing to compromise on rate for a story, if the prestige might be worth it, or if you're okay getting paid a rather high project rate, if it's a rights grab, for instance.
I agree. I also want to say here that I'm a big people pleaser. So turning down work has traditionally been really hard for me. I actually made saying no one of my big goals for the year, for year two of my business, because I was listening to a podcast with a business coach and they said, at some point, the only way to grow your business is to say no to the opportunities that don't work for you so you can say yes to better opportunities. And I was like, oh, duh, this makes sense, but it's just really hard for me. But, if you clog your schedule with low paying assignments with clients who don't treat you well and take up all your time, you don't have bandwidth to say yes to ambitious, high paying assignments with clients who will stabilize your business. So even after I made this a goal, I would say I still really struggle when someone offers me something to decide whether or not I'm going to say no. I have this thing where I think people are going to be mad at me. And I think this is actually common. But the reality is that the people who offer me these assignments, I don't think they care if I say no. Like, it's really not about me. I don't think they get mad at me, but it freaks me out. So I have to write pro and cons lists for assignments sometimes just to convince myself whether or not they're a good fit.
Jenni, I am really, really proud of you for all the times you've said no.
Aw, thank you. You too. It's nice to hear that sometimes, honestly. And I think it's a good thing to tell yourself or a colleague. Like, it's actually very hard to say no.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had trouble saying that too. And where it's burned me, it's when I took on too much work and I just couldn't keep it in my schedule without feeling insanely burnt out by the end. So if helping you say no is practicing with a friend over Zoom or at more than 6 feet apart, or saying it to yourself in the mirror, like practice saying it. I think it's important to say that saying no is a big, big, big power move. It takes practice, and it's something that a lot of seasoned freelancers still struggle with.
So we also recognize that it's a privilege to say no, obviously, especially right now during a time where there feels like there is less work.
Because this is tough, this week we asked some of our experienced freelancer colleagues to send in voice memos about why they say no and how they do it. Here is our first submission.
I'm Joshua Sokol, a freelance science journalist calling in from Boston. The assignments you get as a science reporter are pretty specific. A lot of the science stories are pegged on a new study that's coming out later that week, like a new paper. I'm talking about like 700 words, you have to do some research, you have to do maybe 2 or 3 phone interviews. When I get an assignment like that, I say yes if it seems like an upgrade over what I was otherwise planning to do that week. And if the money is good, which it often is on quick science turnaround stories. Or I'll say yes if I'm genuinely excited by the story. Or I'll say yes if I really want to develop a relationship with that editor who gave me the assignment or the publication. Then I say no if these conditions aren't true. Sometimes also I'll decline if I think that another writer is going to get a similar assignment in another publication and do a better job than me. For me, the big danger in saying yes is that I'll be using this quick assignment and the money and the structure it provides as a way to avoid putting in the necessary work on a really aspirational project that takes a while to build. Like, instead of being proactive and trying to develop a story that could net me money, prestige, passion all at the same time, that I would just be reacting to whatever has landed in my inbox on that particular day.
Josh's Colin really gets into the heart of business priorities. I really like that he weighs those things, like, is there something I should be doing longer term, or am I just taking this assignment that's in front of me right now because it's what I have and I possibly need the money, or for other reasons?
Agreed. I think he does a really good job of letting you into his process, right? That's all the questions that are going on in his brain, because it is easier to think short term, but sometimes you have to think long term in order to be strategic for your business.
Brent Crane, San Diego. In 2016, I was living in Cambodia and was assigned a feature that quickly got complicated. It was for an online magazine, and I was offered $700 to write about a rich pedophile who had just been arrested after a big global manhunt. It was exhausting reporting it, both logistically and emotionally, and after a couple of weeks, I had to break the contract. Ultimately, I just couldn't bring myself to report such a piece for a fee that small.
Oh my God, that story sounds like a trip, but also that's a valid decision to start on a project, realize it's going to expand beyond what your project rate would allow you to do, and realize you need to cut it out. Like, scope creep is really real. We've talked about this before. And freelancers are definitely forced to look at the equation of time equals money, just like Brent said. The more time you spend on a project, the less you're actually making.
Hi, it's Lesley Evans Ogden here. What are some things that I say no to? One thing I've said no to in the last 6 months is a PR firm that reached out to ask if I could write some stories that would include links in them to corporations or businesses that they wanted to promote. That seemed kind of sneaky to me, and it was a no-no, because it crossed an ethical boundary that I wasn't willing to cross. I do almost exclusively journalism, and I would consider doing corporate copywriting if and only if it doesn't compromise my ability to write the kinds of journalistic pieces that I enjoy writing. Late in 2019, I was also approached by a government agency who wanted me to compile a report for them. And although the money probably would have been good, I said no because I frequently interview scientists from that agency, and I didn't want to put myself in conflict of interest or compromise my ability in the future to write stories that drew from this research agency and their work. I also say no to almost any writing that pays less than $1 per word, with very few exceptions. And the other thing I almost always say no to is opportunities that come with bad contracts. As a freelancer, a bad contract is a big red flag. It tells you that your professionalism and integrity are not being respected. I have to say, though, that when I first started freelancing, it was hard to say no to new opportunities. But as my career as a freelancer has progressed, I've learned to be more protective of my work-life balance, though my family might laugh at me for suggesting that such a thing exists. But I am pretty good now at protecting my evenings and weekends as family time. So when my plate is already full and a new opportunity comes along, I'll most often pass along that opportunity to a freelancer friend or colleague that I know and trust. I like to pay it forward.
Lesley more or less touched on everything we said, and I'm really glad she brought up the question of conflicts of interest. You, that is, everyone listening to this podcast who is freelancing or thinking of freelancing, that's you. You get to decide what your boundaries are, whether these are ethical boundaries or your boundaries with regards to rate. Stick with them. It drives your business model.
Definitely. I once was in talks with a company about doing a project together, and it turned out that they wanted me to put my name on stories that were sponsored, and the sponsored stories could only use sources from a report that was put out by an insurance company. And I said, no, like, there's no amount of money that would allow that to be a possibility for me. So ethical considerations matter, I think, especially if you're doing brand work. The people who offered me that assignment were very angry when I turned it down, but I stuck to my guns. So you get to make your rules, and once you know what your rules are, you can stick to them. Okay, we have 2 more submissions, and we're actually going to play them together because I think the takeaways from these 2 are sort of similar.
This is Alice Driver. I'm in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, in self-quarantine. I had a producer at Reveal for the Center for Investigative Reporting reach out to me in 2017. She had read some of my work at Long Reads, and she was interested in me producing a radio story. It was my first radio story, and when I received the contract, it had a clause that was a rights grab for any book or movie rights that would come out of the work. At the time, I had a book agent in New York who was interested in the same story. I had not signed with her, but I did contact her, and she offered to review the contract that Reveal sent me. And she sent recommendations for changes to Reveal, and they pushed back. But I do think that because I had the support of an agent, that I was able to maintain the rights to my own work, to a future book or a future movie. And what I learned from that was really just to use all resources at hand.
My name is Emily Krieger, and I'm a freelance fact checker, writer, and editor in Seattle. There are two big reasons why I say no to jobs, and they are there's not enough time to do the job properly and in a way that I'm proud of. If that's the case, if I'm going to have to slapdash something together, then no thanks. It's not going to help me to put my name on that, and it's not going to help everybody else involved in the team. And if that's the case, if I think, wow, this is really too much work in too little time, then I let the person who's making the offer know that and decide whether or not they've got some wiggle room. And honestly, more often than not, there is wiggle room. People can find ways to get creative. And I think it's also a relief for them that somebody said, oh my God, this schedule's crazy. Can we get more time? And it didn't have to be that person. I'll be the fall gal asking the question. And if we get the time, great. We can have a more humane work schedule. And if we don't, then this was not going to be a good fit for me and my family, because it's not just about having a sustainable job for myself. It also has to fit my family and its needs. I have 2 little kids, and they depend on me, and I have to hold space for them every single day. I can't just work every day. I've got to make time for all the other parts of life. So in a way, having kids has been very clarifying about what my boundaries are and sticking to them. And back to the other reason why I say no, and that's money. If the pay is too low and I can't cover my expenses, which sometimes I have to tell or remind clients include self-employment tax, childcare, I am saving for my retirement, and I buy my own computer, all the things, all the costs that go into freelance. I consider it a service to the journalism profession to respond to a lowball offer and tell someone not only is that a lowball offer, but I can tell you why in a pretty short email. And I can tell you what other outlets or people are paying for comparable work. And if that person responds, I can't pay you that much, or they don't respond at all, then I don't consider that a loss, because it was never a good fit to begin with, really. And if they do respond and say, yeah, I could pay you more, how about this? Or how about I just accept what other people are paying you for comparable work and you've proposed as the fee? That's fantastic. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked, because that would be tragic if I just undervalued myself and made not enough money to meet my needs and expenses and to match my value. So I guess the point is ask for what you need. Be honest. Be that person who's being honest about your time and financial needs. And if somebody really wants to work with you and they have the budget and they have the time, that's a conversation and you can make it happen. If they don't have flexibility, then it was not a good connection to begin with. And if you find yourself constantly being turned down or constantly overworked for too little money, then that is a sign that you have to go back to the business model drawing board and figure out how much money you need to make every month to cover your expenses and how you go about making that money. And it's hopefully not by just chronically being overworked and underpaid. So that's where I think it's really important for journalists to speak up and say, this is what my needs are, and for the publications or people who are hiring freelance journalists to listen. And hopefully the more journalists that share what their real needs are, the more we can move the needle to normalizing fair, sustainable wages for journalists.
I love both of these audio submissions because they're a reminder that even if we're inclined to say no to something, we might want to ask, is there a way to get to yes? Like, what can we negotiate? For Alice, it was her rights on a story she spent significant time on. And for Emily, I really love how she laid off the trade-off between time to complete a project and money.
Yeah, I really like flipping this so it's not just saying no, but also thinking about what can you do to turn it into a yes? I also want to say I really relate to what Emily said about freelancing with children and how that changes your priorities. You all know I'm newly back to work after having a baby, and my son is 5 months old now, and I really have less time overall. So the work that I am doing needs to be paid very well. It needs to fit in with my family's schedule, and it has to be a pretty smooth process. Like, I don't have extra energy right now to deal with things that are messy. So I'm really conscious now with children, like that figures into my saying yes or no. I don't want to waste time because that's time I can't get back that I want to spend with my son. And like Emily said, kids don't really wait for work to get done, right? So this is a whole new world, but I think that having to support a family has actually given me more reasons to say no, and also more bravery to stick with my guns about negotiating.
I also really, really love what Emily said about feeling chronically overworked and underpaid. I think I felt this way for the first 2 years of freelancing in the US. And if that's something anyone who's listening is experiencing, I think it's a great window into going back to your business model's drawing board. This is something I think both Jenni and I talk about with writers who we coach. I like to tell them straight up, okay, this is how much money you want to make a year. This is how many hours you want to work a week. You want to take this much time off. Therefore, you won't work for any less than whatever rate that is.
Yes, I love that. I have people write those numbers on a sticky note and put it on their desk or their computer. It's like, this is my rate, right? These are the hours I work. And I think it helps to see that when you're feeling desperate and someone offers you an assignment, but you can do better, right? So you don't make a panic decision. And I love when Emily said, I don't consider saying no to any of these things a loss because it was never a good fit to begin with. I might put that on my own wall. So I also think we should talk a little bit about saying no based on work-life balance, because Emily said some interesting things about that in regards to burnout. Wudan, have you ever said no because you wanted to protect your personal life?
I mean, I don't have a family besides my fur dog, so my answer is a little different, but an example I like to draw from time to time is if it's summer in Seattle and I currently have a weekday with no calls and it's sunny and it's beautiful, I'd rather go hiking than spend a day on the computer. I always say time away from work is just as important as time that I'm working, perhaps even more valuable because being outside helps me clear my head and get focused. What about you, Jenni?
I totally feel that. I think, we forget that the slow days are necessary in order to have the energy we need to deal with those crazy days, right? I actually end up having to say no to projects now even more often because of my family, like I said, and I don't work on Fridays. And previously, I didn't work on Fridays because I was working on personal projects. Now I'm taking care of a kid. So that really automatically cuts that day out, right? And it limits some opportunities for me. So I have also been trying to prioritize hiking once a week with my family because it is very, very good for my mental health. And so for me, that means seeking out product reviews for outdoor gear assignments versus working on maybe more quick turn news assignments or explainers. So ultimately, doing product reviews really brings me more joy, and it also allows me to get outside. I think a lot about which opportunities that are offered to me or that I'm looking for might align with my values and keep me kind of happy for the long term, right? I also think this burnout piece is really interesting. Like, I'm getting better at telling when I'm full up before I hit burnout, right? Rather than in the middle of it. But it's really hard. So I can sometimes tell when I need a break, and I have to be really a good manager to myself and turn down assignments if I'm not going to get a break. And it's so hard to do, but I really try to keep track of all my assignments in a spreadsheet so I can see when the list gets too long. And when the list is too long, that is when I have to say no.
Yeah, I agree with this very much. In, I think, March or late March, early April, when coronavirus is really hitting the fan, and I was trying to figure out why I felt so burnt out. And then so I actually went to my spreadsheet and listed out all the assignments I had ongoing and how much money I would be able to invoice for it. And I saw that I was making basically twice the amount of my target income. And I was like, okay, that's why I feel like I want to cry all the time from how stressful this is. And then I stopped taking work. Like, I just had to draw that boundary because I didn't know how I was going to get anything else done.
Yeah. And then that you don't have the brain space either to really like dedicate to all these projects. I have had a similar moment. I remember when I was pregnant looking at my list and realizing I had 22 stories that were like in some semblance of being worked on, right? Like some were with editors and some I just pitched, but it was like nuts. And no wonder my brain felt like it couldn't focus on anything. So, noticing that I think is a really important thing. So, Wudan, why don't you tell me, have you ever said no because of like red flags within your initial interaction with an editor? Like maybe an editor who's slow to respond or, something else that could affect your mental health if you invested in working with that person?
That's a really great question. I mean, maybe we talked about it on the podcast. I've definitely said this in public before, but part of this whole initial interaction with an editor, I kind of look at my email tracker just because I want to make sure that they're reading my emails. If they're just reading my emails and ignoring me, or reading my emails but not getting back to me, that's not super fun. I like that my email tracker tells me because I need information. Like, information is good for my mental health in this case. But, I can't think of many. I have had editors at publications that don't pay their freelancers on time reach out and solicit story ideas, and I've just straight up said no. And I said, please let me know if your payment schedules end up changing to net 30. I actually just generally wish editors were more disclosing about rates up front in that first email, rather than asking us to spend time developing story ideas and then realizing that we can't work for however much they're offering.
Yeah, I remember when I started my business, I did a bunch of informational interviews and I talked to a couple women who ran content agencies or businesses, or, in some way were telling stories. And all of them told me a version of the same thing, which was trust your gut. You will know when something is not a good fit. And they all said that they really sort of developed that muscle, not at the beginning, but maybe like 3 or 4 years in. So if I'm honest with myself, I think they're right. Like in relationships that haven't ended up working out in my favor, a needy client who I had to fire, or an assignment that like drags on and on and on, I actually probably could have seen that up front. I could have noticed that things were going to go south, but I ignored the warning signs. For me, I think warning signs are someone who doesn't specify rates or payment schedules up front. Like Wudan said, someone who's not responsive to ideas, an editor who asks more and more and more and more questions without actually solidifying that you're working on an assignment. Maybe a person who's disrespectful of your time. This is actually a big one for me. Like they email you at 9 p.m. or on the weekends and they expect a response. Or even someone who expects work to get done really well and really fast, but they're paying you like next to nothing. So all those things matter. And I think they will just keep happening throughout the relationship, right? If they're happening at the beginning, they're going to happen the whole way through.
Definitely. And Jenni, I love what you said that, you fire clients. Like, yes, I think we forget that we as freelancers have the power to do that. Mm-hmm. It's a two-way street, right? So like, an editor can be like, no to an assignment, no to a pitch, whatever, but we also have the power to say no. I think what you just said goes back to a lot of what we said about that first assignment being a trial run, like a first date. I've learned a lot about how different clients work from that first assignment. If it ends up being a bit of a terrible experience on my part, I will avoid pitching that publication or working with that editor in the future. Like, we all have the power to not return to a quote unquote bad relationship.
Yes. The experiment, as you all know, is one of my favorite tools. Like, do one test assignment with a new client and then you can get out of it if you need to. You're not trapped in some sort of relationship for months. And I also encourage people to often the first story that they pitch to an editor to have it be smaller. You don't want an ambitious 6-month story with someone you've never worked with before. So try it out with guardrails and then you can step away. If it's not a fit, you can fire them just like they can fire you. So Wudan, I am curious about one last thing. How do you follow up with an editor if you don't want to take the assignment this time, but you might want to work with them in the future?
So it depends on the context, and I have a slew of options that I pick from. So if I'm tapped out for the week, I'll say, I don't have capacity to take this on this time, but please do reach out if I can be of help after some arbitrary date. Or I'll say, I don't think I'm the best person for this given your deadline, but here are a few other writers I would try, and give them those names and contacts. Or I'll say, this rate won't allow me to do what we propose in depth, but maybe we can change the scope of the assignment. And that, of course, warrants more of a conversation.
Yeah, I love this. I think those are all responses that keep the relationship ongoing. Someone once told me that you need like some gigs on the bench. So you have all your players out on the field, but you have sort of a B-level lineup of people you could go to if you need more work. And I think that's where those clients can sometimes land. You say maybe later, right? So if you're an all access member, this week we are going to send out a list of ways to say no that won't sully a relationship, some templates you can use. And then we will also send you a little checklist of reasons why you might say no to work so that you can put that on your desk and look at it when you're trying to make a decision. And I also wish I could send you all a poster that says you deserve to get paid well for your work, because that is a big part of this. You are valuable and you're not being valued in certain situations. That is absolutely a reason to say no.
Agreed. And just a reminder that saying no doesn't mean you'll never get an assignment again from that same editor, from that same publication, or at all. You will. Have the confidence to believe in that.
It's all about that abundance mindset that we talk about. So, if there's enough out there for all of us and you can take time to pick assignments that are right for you, it's going to make your freelance career much more sustainable over the long haul.
Yeah, perhaps not exactly that during Corona times, but maybe this helps you have a framework of how to think about what to say yes or no to, even during these times. So, I hope the takeaway from this episode is pretty clear that saying no is a business decision. Done professionally, it does not signify the end of a relationship with an editor or publisher, and it's actually a very necessary part of a successful business.
I love it. Also, I wanted to say that you should all send us your stories, especially about saying no. We have been getting a lot of emails lately about negotiation wins, contract wins, people who have figured out that their rates are too low and they're giving themselves a raise. And those emails truly make our days. So please keep sending them.
Yeah, they're the best. All the wins. Okay, it's time to go prioritize our work schedules and assignments. Bye, Jenny.
Bye, Wudan.
Season 1 of the Writers Co-op is made possible by a grant from the National Association of Science Writers. The Writers Co-op is hosted by me, Wudan, Gan, and Jenny Gritters, and produced by Susan Vallet.